Chapter 6 of The Log of a Cowboy by Andy Adams. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Reminiscent Night. On the ninth morning we made our second start from the Indian Lakes. An amusing incident occurred during the last night of our camp at these waterholes. Coyotes had been hanging around our camp for several days, and during the quiet hours of the night these scavengers of the plain had often ventured in near the wagon in search of scraps of meat or anything edible. Rod Wheat and Ash Borrowstone had made their beds down some distance from the wagon, and the coyotes, as they circled round the camp, came near their beds, and in sniffing about awoke Borrowstone. There was no more danger of attack from these cowards than from field mice, but their presence annoyed Ash, and as he dared not shoot, he threw his boots at the varmints. Imagine his chagrin the next morning to find that one boot had landed among the banked embers of the campfire and was burned to a crisp. It was looked upon as a capital joke by the outfit, as there was no telling when we would reach a store where he could secure another pair. The new trail, after bearing to the westward for several days, turned northward, paralleling the old one, and a week later we came into the old trail over 100 miles north of the Indian Lakes. With the exception of one 30-mile drive without water, no fault could be found with the new trail. A few days after coming into the old trail, we passed Mason, a point where trail herds usually put in for supplies. As we passed during the middle of the afternoon, the wagon and a number of the boys went into the burg. Quince Forrest and Billy Honeyman were the only two in the outfit for whom there were any letters, with the exception of a letter from Lovell, which was common property. Never having been over the trail before, and not even knowing that it was possible to hear from home, I wasn't expecting any letter, but I felt a little twinge of homesickness that night when Honeyman read us certain portions of his letter, which was from his sister. Forrest's letter was from a sweetheart, and after reading it a few times he burnt it, and that was all we ever knew of its contents, for he was too foxy to say anything, even if it had not been unfavorable. Borrowstone swaggered around camp that evening in a new pair of boots, which had the Lone Star set in filigree work in their red tops. At our last camp at the lakes, the Rebel and I, as partners, had been shamefully beaten in a game of 7-up by Bull Durham and John Officer, and we had demanded satisfaction in another trial around the fire that night. We borrowed McCann's lantern, and by the aid of it and the campfire had an abundance of light for our game. In the absence of a table, we unrolled a bed and sat down Indian fashion over a game of cards, in which all friendship ceased. The outfit, with the exception of myself, had come from the same neighborhood, and an item in Honeyman's letter causing considerable comment was a wedding which had occurred since the outfit had left. It seemed that a number of the boys had sparked the bride in times past, and now that she was married, their minds naturally became reminiscent over old sweethearts. "The way I make it out," said Honeyman, in commenting on the news, "is that the girl had met this fellow over in the next county while visiting her cousins the year before. My sister gives it as a horseback opinion that she'd been engaged to this fellow nearly 8 months. Girls, you know, savvy each other that way. Well, it won't affect my appetite any if all the girls I know get married while I'm gone." "You certainly have never experienced a tender passion," said Fox Quarternight to our horse wrangler, as he lighted his pipe with a brand from the fire. "Now I have. That's the reason why I sympathize with these old beaux of the bride. Of course I was too old to stand any show on her string, and I reckon the fellow who got her ain't so powerful much, except his veneering and being a stranger, which was a big advantage. To be sure, if she took a smile to this stranger, no other fellow could check her with a 3/4 rope and a snubbing post. I've seen girls walk right by a dozen good fellows and fawn over some scrub. My experience teaches me that when there's a woman in it, it's haphazard pot luck with no telling which way the cat will hop. You can't play any system, and merit cuts little figure in general results." "Fox," said Durham, while Officer was shuffling the cards, Your auger seems well oiled and working keen tonight. Suppose you give us that little experience of yours in love affairs. It will be a treat to those of us who have never been in love, and won't interrupt the game a particle. Cut loose, won't you?" "It's a long time back," said Quarternight meditatively, "and the scars have all healed, so I don't mind telling. I was born and raised on the border of the Blue Grass region in Kentucky. I had the misfortune to be born of poor but honest parents, as they do in stories. No hero ever had the advantage of me in that respect. In love affairs, however, it's a high card in your hand to be born rich. The country around my old home had good schools, so we had the advantage of a good education. When I was about 19 I went away from home one winter to teach school, a little country school about 15 miles from home. But in the old States, 15 miles from home makes you a dead rank stranger. The trustee of the township was shucking corn when I went to apply for the school. I simply whipped out my peg and helped him shuck out a shock or two while we talked over school matters. The dinner bell rang, and he insisted on my staying for dinner with him. Well, he gave me a better school than I had asked for, better neighborhood, he said, and told me to board with a certain family who had no children. He gave his reasons, but that's immaterial. They were friends of his, so I learned afterwards. They proved to be fine people. The woman was one of those kindly souls who never know where to stop. She planned and schemed to marry me off in spite of myself. The first month that I was with them she told me all about the girls in that immediate neighborhood. In fact, she rather got me unduly excited, being a youth and somewhat verdant. She dwelt powerful heavy on a girl who lived in a big brick house which stood back of the road some distance. The girl had gone to school at a seminary for young ladies near Lexington, studied music and painting, and was way up on everything. She described her to me as black-eyed with raven tresses, just like you read about in novels. Things were rocking along nicely when a few days before Christmas a little girl who belonged to the family who lived in the brick house brought me a note one morning. It was an invitation to take supper with them the following evening. The note was written in a pretty hand, and the name signed to it. I'm satisfied now it was a forgery. My landlady agreed with me on that point. In fact, she may have mentioned it first. I never ought to have taken her into my confidence like I did, but I wanted to consult her, showed her the invitation, and asked her advice. She was in seventh heaven of delight and had me answer it at once. Accept the invitation with pleasure and a lot of stuff that I never used before. She had been young once herself. I used up 5 or 6 sheets of paper in writing the answer, spoilt one after another, and the one I did send was a flat failure compared to the one I received. Well, the next evening, when it was time to start, I was nervous and uneasy. It was nearly dark when I reached the house, but I wanted it that way. Say, but when I knocked on the front door of that house, it was with fear and trembling. "Is this Mr. Quarternight?" inquired a very affable lady who received me. I knew I was one of old man Quarternight's 7 boys, and admitted that that was my name, though it was the first time anyone had ever called me Mr. I was welcomed, ushered in, and introduced all around. There were a few small children whom I knew, so I managed to talk to them. The girl whom I was being braced against was not a particle overrated, but sustained the Kentucky reputation for beauty. She made herself so pleasant and agreeable that my fears soon subsided. When the man of the house came in, I was cured entirely. He was gruff and hearty, opened his mouth and laughed deep. I built right up with him. We talked about cattle and horses until supper was announced. He was really sorry I hadn't come earlier, so as to look at a 3-year-old colt that he set a heap of store by. He showed him to me after supper with a lantern. Fine colt, too. I don't remember much about the supper, except that it was fine, and I came near spilling my coffee several times. My hands were so large, and my coat sleeves so short. When we returned from looking at the colt, we went into the parlor. Say, fellows, it was a little the nicest thing that I ever went against. carpet that made you think you were going to bog down every step.